What if Captain America never froze? That simple change would have long-lasting repercussions to the entire MCU. If he immediately survived his icy plunge, then S.H.I.E.L.D. might have formed faster, his relationship with Bucky would be potentially more interesting, and everything we've seen from Iron Man to Endgame would be dramatically different. But is that for better or for worse? Would Steve Rogers have remained the righteous Boy Scout all those years, or would he falter the more he saw the world change around him? I'll talk about all that in today's video. Let's get started right now. Captain America would have left an unbelievable impact on the entire timeline and the overall MCU if he was never frozen in ice. And really, did he have to become a capsicle? There our hero was, cruising through the air carrying a plane's worth of sinister destruction in his first movie, and of course, Steve decides to sacrifice himself for the greater good. The Boy Scout immediately chooses to plunge the ship down to the icy depths of the Atlantic to get rid of all the dangerous cargo. But like Steve, yes, it's a split decision and it's really admirable, but you think there would be a way to insulate yourself or brace for landing a little bit better, right? Okay, even if there was no time to do anything else, then the government should have found him faster, right? I mean, they found the Tesseract pretty easily at the bottom of the ocean, and they know what direction the ginormous ship was headed, so I mean, you would think Howard would be able to track it a bit better. In my head, I always picture the government finding the cube and then just shrugging and giving their best, well, we tried, looks before giving up. And I've always thought a cool explanation would be that because Hydra infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D., that they slowly manipulated events to make the search for Steve Rogers face major hurdles. But really, that doesn't make sense in the timeline. Cool idea though. So in the movie we got, the side effect of Cap's actions is that he's frozen in ice for almost 70 years. He missed a lot of important things in his life, like the Howard the Duck movie and the time that Nick Fury was cast to play Mace Windu in the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And we all know how things went. Steve went on to become the leader of the Avengers. He stood up to corruption and followed his own path, leading him to go rogue. He was reunited with his best bro Bucky, who coincidentally also became a super soldier, which, hey, small world. And then was a key part in saving the world from the Mad Titan before choosing his own happiness over the needs of the world. But what if the entire history was different? What if Cap found a way to survive his icy plunge and lived his whole life in his own time? Would he still have had his happy ending? Would it be such a large repercussion that the entire MCU timeline would have been altered, resulting in a spectacularly different chain of events? Maybe. That's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going through the idea of what if Captain America never froze and how that would fundamentally change things. I'll discuss all the stuff in the past that he would have had an effect on. I'll discuss how him being old man Steve would have affected the Avengers, and I'll discuss his relationships with those closest to him. Sounds good? Great. So let's talk about the immediate effect of Steve not freezing. The first is the formation of S.H.I.E.L.D. Well, no, I guess the first is that Steve gets to have his date with Peggy.
I had a date.
The band would have played something slow, Peggy would have taught Steve to dance, and he would only step on her feet a little bit. Okay, but after that, the real work begins. So going forward in the original timeline, we have to discuss what's canon and what's not. For instance, it's pretty clear Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is not canon. I mean, I guess depending on who you ask. They love to dance around that issue. Like, they'll say it's not canon, but then they'll tease Chloe Bennett's Daisy Johnson having a cameo in Secret Invasion. So it's all a bit timey-wimey, different university. And then you have the Agent Carter TV show, which seems pretty canon and has been talked about being canon, but then that directly contradicts the events of the Agent Carter one-shot, so is that not canon? It doesn't really matter, I guess. Let's just say the timeline is in flux ever since He Who Remains got stabbed, so it's all simultaneously canon and not canon at the same time. Easy, right? But no matter what, we know the general gist. Peggy returned to working for the SSR, but was stuck doing administrative work because she was a woman and constantly overlooked, until she was able to showcase how awesome she was, and eventually went on to form and run S.H.I.E.L.D. with Howard Stark and Colonel Phillips sometime in the early 1950s. The first big question, if Steve was around after World War II, would S.H.I.E.L.D. have formed faster? I think it would have. Steve had successfully broken out of his poster boy mold and was an active agent in the field, so I think he would have been a catalyst for the organization to get the ball rolling. So if S.H.I.E.L.D. had formed with Cap in a leadership role, the two biggest questions are about Hydra and the Tesseract. We know that after S.H.I.E.L.D. partook in Operation Paperclip, which saw the recruitment of enemy German scientists to their own side, Arnim Zola secretly rebuilt Hydra within S.H.I.E.L.D.'s ranks. Could Steve have stopped it? Honestly, probably not. If a lot of good people like Peggy and Howard missed this happening in the OG timeline, I think it would have happened regardless if Steve was there. So Hydra may still have risen, but the Tesseract is a different story. We know from Captain Marvel and then later in the Avengers that the Tesseract was a source of fascination for S.H.I.E.L.D., who thought they could experiment on it for positive results. Where do you think Steve would have landed on this issue? We saw in the Avengers that he got tremendously mad at Nick Fury for making weapons with the Tesseract, as that's what Hydra did in World War II, but would Steve have been more on board with things like Project Pegasus, which was adamant about using the Tesseract for energy alternatives? I think it would have been tough. Steve understood that the Tesseract was a power that they didn't understand and shouldn't mess with. But I think as Steve got a little older and went through different milestones like the Cold War, he would understand that the Tesseract is a power that would need to be explored more. So those two things, I don't think Steve would have had much of an impact on, but there are two other big things that would have had major ripples in the MCU: the Super Soldier Serum and Bucky Barnes. In Falcon and the Winter Soldier, we learn that the US Army developed their own Super Soldier Serum test and used it on African Americans, namely Isaiah Bradley, who became a super soldier. We know that he was inhumanely locked away, and while I do think the Army still would have replicated the Soldier Serum without Steve's knowledge, I don't think they could have kept the new Captain America secret from Steve, and Steve would have worked hard to free Isaiah Bradley and keep him the Captain America after Steve hung up his shield. This would have been an interesting story as well. I imagine during the Korean War in the 50s, Steve would be going through a tough transition. Either he could remain a Captain America and be in the field as a soldier, or he could help lead S.H.I.E.L.D. from an executive position. With the news of Isaiah Bradley being a super soldier, this would allow Steve to hand off the S.H.I.E.L.D. to someone else and then also be in charge. Obviously, there's more complicated issues than that, but I like Steve choosing to lead rather than always being on the ground taking orders. That would be a natural progression of his character arc. And then there's Bucky. Let's talk about Bucky in the next point since it directly relates to Iron Man and the present day. Maybe the biggest change to the past timeline, if Cap never froze, would be Bucky Barnes. The Winter Soldier first started popping up in the 1950s, and if Steve was directly involved with S.H.I.E.L.D., are you telling me he never would have realized it was Bucky? Especially if Steve developed a professional relationship with Isaiah Bradley, who fought Bucky in the Korean War? I think Steve would have put the pieces together much sooner. It was pretty easy for Steve to break Bucky's brainwashing. He just had to hit him with the old "I'm with you" to the end of the line throwback, and the real Bucky started to break through. There's a lot of implications to this if Bucky was saved, but let's say that Steve saves Bucky before the 90s and essentially stops him from assassinating the Starks. Now, it feels like Hydra would have still found a way to get to Howard and Maria, so their deaths might be one of those fixed points in time, but at least Steve's relationship with Tony might be different. Steve might have been part of young Tony's life at least a little bit, but Steve could still feel responsible for their deaths and essentially cover it up to protect Tony from the harsh truth. Then Tony could have gone on his hero's journey, but now with one big difference. With Old Man Steve essentially a vital part of picking the Avengers for the team, he would be adamant about leaving Tony off of it. It could come across like Steve doesn't want a rogue personality like Tony on the team, a fact that's probably technically for the best, but the real reason would be that he doesn't want any harm to come to Tony under his watch after what happened with his friend Howard. So by the time the first Avengers movie rolls around, just who would be on the roster? And what would even be the threat? I still think it would be Loki. The events of Thor would still be the same, and Loki would have found a way to teleport to Earth through the Tesseract somehow, even if S.H.I.E.L.D. wasn't experimenting on it for weaponry. We just might have missed out on that cool opening scene in the Avengers, and Hawkeye might never have been brainwashed. Imagine that. Hawkeye has gone through a huge character revamp since the first Avengers, Avengers movie. Everyone thought he was super uncool because of how his character was handled in that first movie, but now that he doesn't have to go through that, his whole destiny is different. Neat. So with Loki on Earth and Steve an old man, he would finally put the Avengers initiative in place. You'd definitely have Thor, who would be there for Loki. You'd have Hawkeye as potentially a team leader. Black Widow is a bit of a question mark, since wasn't she only there to begin with because Clint was brainwashed and she wanted to save him? Maybe Clint, now not brainwashed, would bring her in anyway. You'd maybe have Bruce Banner and the Hulk, like they'd bring in Banner and he'd still Hulk out. And then I also think you would have a version of Ant-Man and the Wasp. We know Hank Pym hated Howard Stark and left S.H.I.E.L.D. because of Howard's treatment of Pym particles, but with Steve there to smooth things over, could this have been avoided? Would Howard have still gone behind Hank's back to replicate those shrinking miracles? Maybe not, which means Ant-Man and the Wasp could be on the original Avengers team. And let's say Captain Marvel was too busy to join up because of space things. I think the crux of the movie could be Steve and Tony working out their differences so that Steve would let Tony be on the Avengers for real. Then the movie ends with this lineup ready to defend Earth against any major threat. After the Avengers, things get a little tricky with the events of Winter Soldier and Civil War. With Bucky already essentially redeemed, there's no need to save him, but you could still form a movie about the destruction of S.H.I.E.L.D. at the hands of Hydra. That movie was originally about Steve realizing that maybe the good guys aren't that different from the bad guys, and finding out the organization he was fighting for was compromised. You could still have that crux, only this time it's even more heavy since Steve has been fighting for S.H.I.E.L.D. for the last 70 years instead of just the last few years. Steve would have come to the conclusion that S.H.I.E.L.D. needs to be revamped and rebuilt in modern times, and it's time for him to retire from his position. He's been fighting the fight for so long that he doesn't know how to do anything else, but realizes that it's time for a big change. Age of Ultron could essentially happen the same way, but it's Civil War which would need a total reassessment. Okay, so Cap has left S.H.I.E.L.D. because of Hydra's infiltration, but he's so old now that he can't be the central conflict against Iron Man in Civil War. I don't want to see Tony beat up a senior citizen, do you? So Tony could still be for government oversight, and Captain America could be for more freedom, but who would be the main face of Cap's side? It would be interesting if it was Spider-Man. Spider-Man as a character usually loves freedom and working on his own for a bit, so with the altered timeline, I wonder if Spider-Man would be the poster hero for fighting on his own. I mean, the idea of seeing Iron Man and Spider-Man start off as ideological enemies before becoming friends is kind of appealing, right? It would also be interesting because the whole plot of Civil War right now hinges on Bucky, but if that's not the case, then what would be the driving force for the film? Just because I'm a little biased about wanting more Hulk stuff, what if Captain America isn't a stable presence in the group, and that causes Hulk to go on a bit of a rampage, and the idea of what to do with him causes a rift between heroes. That way you can have these two sides fighting for government oversight or not, while also paving the way for a Planet Hulk movie. That would be fun, right? Okay, we're in the Endgame now. How would Infinity War and Endgame be different if Steve Rogers wasn't involved? Well, working through the plot of Infinity War, really there's not a whole lot Steve could have done. It's Endgame where things get a little tricky. Steve couldn't be part of the time heist to get everything back, so depending on who's left standing after the snap, and basing it off of keeping everyone who snapped away still snapped away, then really the only option that could fill Steve's spot is Captain Marvel. They write Captain Marvel out of Endgame pretty quickly because she has to go protect the universe, but maybe Steve being an old man and presumably having a more direct line with her due to his not being frozen over the years means he can convince her to go on the mission. I mean, it's a pretty important mission, right? In Endgame, she says that Earth isn't a priority because she's protecting the entire universe, but if Steve asks her to go on a mission to save the entire universe, on top of being able to return basically the same moment they left, then that shouldn't be an issue. Captain Marvel on the mission makes everything a bit easier and would be an interesting side effect of Steve not being there because he's busy eating tapioca pudding or playing bingo or something. Steve Rogers is one of the most important characters in the first three phases of the MCU. His arc from a selfless hero to getting to pursue his own happy ending on his own terms is very fitting, and I think is arguably the better arc between him and Iron Man. Yeah, I said it, but he also impacts impacts the story in such a unique way where taking him out of the equation and putting him in a different role changes everything about the story and the way things unfold. Do you think the MCU would still be as successful if they never froze Captain America and instead kept him as an old man running things from behind the scenes? I mean, I would have loved to see Chris Evans in old man makeup for long stretches of time, wouldn't you? And I also would love to see how his character would continue post-Endgame with the emergence of a new Captain America. Would Sam still take on the mantle? What would Steve and Sam's relationship be like if Isaiah Bradley was more involved in everyone's life? Just think about all those ramifications. There's so many different variations and ideas of how things would be different that it's enough to make your head spin. But that's the fun part of all these what ifs, don't you think? Do you think Howard and Steve would have formed as deep of a friendship as Tony and Steve did?
I do.
Yes, Howard and Tony are different, but they're cut from the same cloth. Yuck, but then we have to imagine Tony growing up calling Captain America like Uncle Steve or something, and that's just weird, right? Anyways, thanks for watching CBR. See you next time.